Do you ever hit pause in life and just kind of think back to what it was like to be 5 or 9 years old on this day in that time period? What was it like to wake up in the morning and to walk down the stairs or walk down the hall and see your mom and dad? What were they making for breakfast? What were the things that were on the TV or in the radio as you guys went to school? What was that like? Do you remember the culture of that time? It's easy for us to kind of look back at that with nostalgia and to realize that in some weird way, we had a connection with our mom and dad because they did much of the same things. They went to their friends' houses. They had jobs after school. They did things that were similar to us. But in some new data that's coming out, we're realizing more and more that it's not like that with the kids that we have. So much of the world has shifted and changed, partly because of what we would call maybe the technological revolution, but also part of it because the culture just looks different. The things that the culture is about, the loves, the things that we work towards, the things that we're loyal to, the things we find ourselves in rhythm of, they're just different. So how can we speak into our kids' lives, especially when, as some new data is showing, so many of them are confused about what gender they are and what sexuality actually is? Well, Dr. Kathy has some important insights for us as we face this dark time. And so we're going to turn to her now for some insight.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby. Not every light is gonna guide you.
So, Dr. Kathy, recent surveys have revealed a growing generational gap in those who identify as LGBTQ. Young adults today are much more likely than young people in previous generations to identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. That's coming out of a new report from the American Enterprise Institute that was released last month. Generational patterns are not likely linear, is what the survey is showing. Almost 1 in 4, that's 23%. Of Gen Z adults and 17% of millennials identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or something else. That's in contrast with nearly equal numbers of Gen X at 6% and baby boomers at 5% who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or something else. These generational differences are primarily driven, some are saying, by the increase in bisexual identity among younger age cohorts. 13% of Gen Z adults identify as bisexual, more than 6 times greater than the corresponding share of baby boomers. So, Dr. Kathy, when Christians hear these stats, obviously we kind of take it home. We look at our kids and there's concern there. And it's natural for many Christians in these circles to kind of look at their kids and say, we should be nervous about this. But there's a lot of studies that show that when kids will identify as something other than their biological sex when they're growing up, that they often grow out of that, we would call it probably dysphoria. They grow out of that maybe confusion of aligning their identity with their actual physical reality. If that's the case, should Christian parents really be concerned about the rise in the number of kids who are identifying in some kind of quote unquote alternative sexual identity?
Yes, I think so. This is fascinating, isn't it? So first of all, the data this is really significant data. And I would love for people to re-listen and write that down, because we need to confront the lie that everybody is gay or everybody is lesbian or, the numbers are going way up. They're going way up in the young people because the culture is chaotic and what they're listening to and who they're following is just, messy, and they want the red carpet moment. And we've talked about some of those things before. It is true that most people do go out of gender dysphoria if we don't interrupt their natural process with medical intervention. It's also really interesting in this data to report, for people who don't know, that gender dysphoria is a leading contributor to homosexuality. So if children, preteens, teens feel that they're in the wrong body, they will often experiment sexually and decide, oh, maybe I'm just gay or just lesbian. And so, there are reasons to interrupt. There's reasons to pray. There's reasons to have conversations, to introduce them to really positive role models and men and women who are maybe different in their gender according to some standard that exists in some false world, but they're coping with it just fine. And we need our kids to know that, it's absolutely okay. So yeah, be concerned. Don't panic. Don't expect, negativity, but yeah, don't put your head in the sand. That's pretty foolish.
Yeah, Dr. Kathy, that's an interesting kind of approach, I think, a little bit, to kind of be concerned, be attentive to it, but not to lose heart and also not to kind of jump all over it. It kind of leads me to this reality inside of this report that I read online about this topic, where Jean Twenge, who's a cultural apologist, she really explains and defines movements in culture in really kind of specific, special terms. I would call it, kind of use that word special, because her research and her insight seems to be really dynamic in how she understands the world. She argues that there's widespread adoption of new technologies recently that has really transformed the American society and has also created really unique generational experiences for young people today that older people like myself, I call myself older. I don't feel it, but I do feel it at the same time. But we don't see the same realities as younger people do because of this technological change. In fact, in one report, I read her, and she said this, quote, "Technological change isn't just about stuff. It's about how we live, which influences how we think and feel and behave," end quote. She kind of says, for instance, that when teenagers are kind of equipped with smartphones, that offers instant virtual access to their friends and has reduced incentives to really spend time with their friends in person. This is a generational shift that we find in Gen Z adults who spend less time during their teenage years kind of hanging out with friends face to face than any other generation. This technological change alters really how we approach and see the world. So kind of knowing this, how do parents understand the issues really surrounding gender and gender identity when really it's a completely different world from every kind of dynamic and facet that we look at, especially as Jean Twenge kind of outlines it? The world is different. So do the laws of nature and gravity not really apply anymore because there has been so much movement on the ground?
Oh my goodness, gravity is still real. But I love that. That's such a fun question. Yeah, her work is really brilliant. This information you just shared with us is reason for parents to be extremely alert to who their children follow on social media, who they say their friends are, who they are regularly texting and doing group chats with, who they're sending selfies and video clips to, as well as who they're following on, social media platforms that I don't even want to mention because I don't want to give them any credence at all. They are becoming like who they're following. We've all become like the people we hang out with. That's just a common understanding. We become like those we hang out with. And our young people today are hanging out more often with people on screens than they are in flesh. And this is why we cannot be unaware. We must be aware, and we must say, no, you may not follow that person anymore because we have seen you take on a persona that's unhealthy, not biblical. We're done. Give me back the phone, which is mine because I've paid for it. And we could go on and on and on, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I love that how you kind of started that answer by saying, gravity is still real. It's still gravity, because it's really true. I think when I look at these issues, I think about it maybe from a dad's perspective, that dads kind of look at things and say, it has to work. At the end of the day, these things just have to work. And so when we look at, all of this, I would call it kind of dysphoria, this confusion around identity or gender or sexuality. At the end of the day, those things really do accomplish a thing. They do a task inside of that. And I think that this kind of is interesting as we kind of prepare ourselves to have these conversations with our kids, knowing kind of like I mentioned before, that Twenge has said that really the landscape has shifted and changed. No longer are we having conversations about the birds and the bees, right? We're having conversations about so many different kind of dynamics, and we want to take things that don't even fit inside of strata and kind of merge them and say that they can coexist, but they don't actually work. So when we look at this topic, I think it's important for us to address this with kids who might, especially kind of down the road, wrestle with this. They might say, my kids might say at some point of their life, and I've said this before, my wife and I have talked about how do we talk to our kids when they come home and say that they're gay or lesbian or trans or have a different identity. What would be some key parts of a conversation that you think adults today should have with kids, knowing that their world is markedly different from us, but also knowing that gravity still is real inside of the world that they live in?
Let me start by saying that you and your wife are really wise to say when they come home, not if they come home, and talk about this. And it's not that you're expecting it. You guys are great parents. You're raising your kids really well with the Christian worldview. And yet they're being exposed to filth and to the lies, and the liar is loud. And so be ready for the conversation so they don't stun you and you stumble all over yourself and make some mistakes in those initial reactions to their fears and their concerns. So I really applaud being ready. And I think that's the first thing we have to say here is, again, don't put your head down on the sand. Be ready. Go to the right conferences, read the right books, listen to podcasts like this, and get ready. And let your kids know that you love them and you care about them, all of them, and who they are. If you have ignored your children and you have, fallen into your own screen and you're getting your work done while they're awake and they could have played a game with you, you're going to have a hard time convincing them that you care enough and love them enough that they would listen to you when the real issues pop up. So be really careful of that. And I think you better be careful of saying, like, if they come home and say, Mom, I think I'm gay. Well, that's ridiculous. You don't start out with, well, that's ridiculous. It's not ridiculous because they're being exposed to so much that is so real in their eyes. And so you listen longer. What makes you think so? Tell me more. I love to teach parents and educators, don't interrogate right away. Just be quiet and listen longer. And I think I'm gay. Well, just listen. And then your kid says, I was teased on the playground, so maybe I really am. Oh my goodness, he thinks he's gay because some kid called him gay? No, that's not a legitimate reason to take to the bank. And so now you have a conversation.
There's a passage out of James that I was reminded of as Dr. Kathy was talking today. It comes out of James chapter 1, and I'm going to begin reading at verse 16. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. My dear brothers and sisters, then take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. I love this encouragement that James gives to the church at this time. It's this really call to be people who listen and do, who are active and engaged. And I think the encouragement that hopefully you've received today, that I've received today as we've participated in this conversation, is really to hit pause a little bit, to listen longer, to have some important conversations. And as James kind of talks about, get rid of moral filth and evil that might be prevalent and kind of around us, not to let it into our homes, but to have it be something that we see, talk about, address, and encourage our kids to think well, and that there's somebody that loves them, that thinks different, maybe, than what the society is pushing towards them. I think giving kids confidence that the world isn't kind of the way that it's being presented to them, but that there is an alternative, there is a reality inside of Christ that is really a bright light cutting through confusion and darkness that they might be buying into today only because it's the only storyline they've ever heard. So let's give them a new storyline. I want to thank you for listening to the Celebrate Kids podcast, to this daily segment, Facing the Dark. On behalf of Dr. Kathy Cook, my name is Wayne Stender, and I'm looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow.